What happens when you hear the term doctors? Do you picture calm faces smiling at you who have only one goal? To save your life at any cost? But what would happen if the ones tasked with protecting your life decide to take it? Who will save you? That's the question Anatomy explores. The Anatomy movie has 2 installments. The first deals with a secret society of doctors obsessed with turning humans into specimens, while the second deals with a group of intelligent doctors obsessed with perfecting the human body. But nothing is as simple as it looks. In today's video, we will talk about the gruesome and bone-chilling stories of the Anatomy franchise. But before we get started with the video, we have a small request for you. If you like our content, subscribe to us and like this video. It might be just a simple click for you, but it means a lot to us. Now that we've got that out of the way, let's get started. Dissecting Terror: Decoding the Horrifying Secrets of Anatomy 2000. Anatomy is a German horror movie released in 2000. The movie's story revolves around our protagonist, Paula Henning, and her discovery of a mysterious secret society in her college. The movie starts in a hospital where a professor teaches his fellow students how to perform post-mortem. Paula Henning stands out among all the students because of her exceptional dissection skills. Later, the professor calls Paula into his cabin and reveals she has been selected to study at the University of Heidelberg. Paula was delighted because of this news and went to meet her grandfather. Her grandfather was also happy with the news and revealed he was once a professor at the University of Heidelberg. Meanwhile, a person wakes up in an operating theater in Heidelberg to find that some doctors are operating on him. This frightens him, and he dies at the very moment. The next day, Paula leaves for Heidelberg on a train. On the train, she meets one of her classmates, Gretchen, who was also selected to study at the University of Heidelberg. Suddenly, a passenger on the train suffers from a heart attack. Paula acts promptly and saves this person's life. The person thanks Paula for saving his life and introduces himself as David. When they reach their destination, Gretchen flirts with David, and they exchange numbers. Later that night, they attend a party where a boy named Casper flirts with Paula. Gretchen has also asked David to come to this party. At the party, when David goes to the toilet, someone attacks him and drags him away. Later, when he opens his eyes, he finds himself in an operating theater. He finds that a few doctors are about to operate on him, so he steals a knife to protect himself. He attacks a doctor who is about to inject something inside him, but his attempt is futile because the injured doctor wakes up and injects him with a fluid that kills him instantly. The next day, Professor Grombeck introduced himself to the class and took them to the university's museum, where they kept replicas of the human body. Right about then, we get to see the specimen of the person who was killed in the starting minutes of the movie, indicating that these aren't replicas, but bodies of real human beings. The next day, students are called to perform post-mortem in the anatomy room, but to Paula's surprise, the body they would be working on turns out to be that of David's. Paula is suspicious that his death was not natural, and there might be something behind it. She takes a few blood samples from his body to investigate further. She finds that the blood samples have hardened and seeks help from a friend to find the reason behind it. Paula sneaks inside the mortuary to take a sample from David's body. She takes the sample but is intrigued by a AAA sign engraved on his feet. She was about to leave, but was caught by the mortuary attendant, who questioned if she had permission from a teacher. She says she has permission from a professor and leaves. The mortuary attendant is unsure and calls someone to tell them they have a peeping Tom. When Paula leaves for her room, she is confronted by Casper, who reveals that he likes her. The next day, the students go for a swim, where Gretchen introduces Hein to Paula. Hein was her new boyfriend, and they had recently hooked up. Later, Paula takes Gretchen to the library and tells her she saw a AAA sign on David's body. This sign stands for Anti-Hippocratic Society. She reveals that it's a secret society that used to operate during the 16th century. They used to kill other humans and turn them into specimens. Paula theorizes that this secret society still exists during present times, and they are behind the murder of their friend. Gretchen does not believe Paula's words and leaves by laughing it off. Later, Paula calls her friend to whom she had sent David's blood samples and asks if he could find anything. Her friend reveals that he found plasma protein inside his blood, and that's the reason his blood had hardened. He theorizes that he might have been injected with some kind of poison, which resulted in his blood hardening and his death. When Paula reached her room, she found that Gretchen was with another guy named Phil. Later, Paula meets Professor Grombeck and tells her about her findings. Grombeck asks her not to be involved in any of this and focus on her studies. That night, Paula finds her bed soaked in blood with a candle under her bed. This turns out to be a ritual from the secret society to warn her to stop snooping around. This confirms her suspicions of the existence of the secret society. Suddenly, someone comes inside her room, so she attacks him. This intruder turns out to be Hein, who says he knows about Gretchen's betrayal and wants to talk about it. Paula listens to him and comforts him. Meanwhile, Gretchen and Phil are in the mortuary, where Gretchen seduces Phil and tells him that she always wanted to have sex inside the morgue halls. In Paula's room, Casper arrives to find her sitting with Hein. He is shocked to find another man inside Paula's room room and leaves them alone. Paula asks Hayne to leave and search for Gretchen. In the morgue room, Phil and Gretchen are about to do the stuff, but Hayne arrives there, and in a fit of rage, he kills Phil. Hayne also injects a syringe inside Gretchen, and her legs start stiffening up. She tries to run, but is unable to because the poison is doing its thing, and she is slowly dying. Hayne follows Gretchen and says she's gorgeous, and he would make her a beautiful specimen. The next day, Paula is still snooping around to find evidence of the existence of the secret society, but Hayne interrupts her and asks her to stop her investigation. Otherwise, the secret society will come for her. Paula was frightened and reached the police station to ask for help, but they laugh off Paula's claims of the existence of the secret society. Later, Paula comes across the basement, where she finds the syringe that was used to inject the victims with poison, but she is surprised by the arrival of Professor Grombeck. Grombeck reveals that they are part of a secret society and have revolutionized the medical field. They kill people and turn them into specimens, which allows students to learn from them. He also reveals that her grandfather was also a part of the society, and this poison was gifted to the society by her grandfather. Paula is upset with this news and goes to confront her grandfather, but finds out that her grandfather has already died. In a secret location, the society members were interrogating Hayne for his rash actions and how his actions had put the secret of the society at risk. Hayne reveals that he killed Gretchen because she cheated on him. The society asks him to cut himself 3 times as punishment for his offense. He accepts his punishment and gives himself 3 cuts on the cheek. Professor Grombeck is unhappy with Hayne's actions and decides to take matters into his own hands. He calls Paula to reveal everything to her, but Hayne kills him off and sets a trap for Paula. Paula arrives in the specimen room because she thinks the professor had called her here, but it was Hayne who called her into the room. Paula tries to run, but Hayne catches her. When Paula wakes up, she finds herself in the morgue room. She discovers that she is unable to move her body and suspects that she was also injected with the same poison. Right about then, Casper arrives and helps her escape by neutralizing the poison, but his attempts are futile as Hayne arrives there with a friend. Paula somehow escapes and kills Hayne and his friend. In the post-credit scenes, we are introduced to 2 students who arrive in the morgue room and say they'll continue the work of the secret society from here. Continuing the nightmare. Who's next? Due to the success of Anatomy, director Stefan Ruzowitzki came up with a sequel in 2003. This time, the story of the movie moves to Berlin. The movie starts with a grand party where all the doctors have arrived to witness the felicitation of Dr. Charles with the Nobel Prize. Dr. Charles's brother Benny was also present at the gathering. Benny was behaving erratically and committed suicide in front of all the guests at the party. The story then shifts to our protagonist, Joe, playing chess with his brother Willie. Willie was suffering from muscle dystrophy. Joe was a doctor, and he recently got an internship in Berlin. Joe was moving to Berlin to look for a cure for his brother. Joe bids goodbye to his family and leaves for Berlin. After arriving in Berlin, Joe meets a lot of nurses. One of the nurses named Lee starts liking Joe. Later in the facility, a doctor named Fred talks to an unknown person and reveals the information he learned about the mysterious suicide of Benny. He reveals that Benny had an overdose of neurocholine, which was the reason he was behaving erratically. The person on the phone asks Fred to come for an emergency operation. When he goes to the operating theater, Dr. Charles and one of his friends drug him and turn him mad. The next day, Charles and the other doctors address the new interns, and Joe was happy to be present in a place with such esteemed doctors. Despite being an intern, Joe was bombarded with work after work, and because of this, he wasn't able to sleep properly. He was impressed by Dr. Charles's work and decided to infiltrate his inner circle. One night, Nurse Lee asked Joe to help the child of a nurse who was bleeding from her nose. Joe finds that she has a cranial fracture and goes against the rules to help her. Dr. Charles noticed this, and he invited Joe to his inner circle. In his first meeting with the inner circle, he meets Victoria, who introduces him to the research team. Later, Victoria tells Joe about the research that Dr. Charles was doing. She reveals that Dr. Charles was creating artificial muscles that can help anyone increase their performance and will also help treat muscle disabilities. He learns that Dr. Charles sometimes used to break the rules and conduct illegal experiments to reach his goals. Joe was completely okay with this because he thought it was for the greater good, and no one used to die because of these experiments. Later, Joe witnesses how the artificial muscle is attached to the body of one of the doctors. That was phase 1 of the experiments, and they were successful at it. Joe was informed that all the doctors inside Charles's inner circle have undergone the same procedure. Later, Joe also goes through the same procedure and gets artificial muscles implanted inside him. But apart from the muscles, a chip-like equipment was also inserted inside his spine. As it turns out, this chip can control the individual's body. This means that it was Charles who killed his brother Benny by controlling him with the help of the chip. The operation was successful, and Joe was happy that now he'd be able to help his brother with the help of artificial muscles. But for the artificial muscles to be ready for others, the doctors must make the muscle go through 2 other phases of the experiment. Meanwhile, Dr. Charles and Hagen realize that one of their team members, Svan, is helping the police with the murder of Benny. So they decide to kill him by controlling him using the chip and making it seem like he committed suicide by jumping off the roof. Joe was informed that he was selected for phase 2 of this experiment, but he was not ready. Thus, Dr. Charles takes him for a run and makes a deal with him. He says he'll help his brother for free if he goes through the experiment. Joe asks his brother Willie to come to Berlin with him because after Joe goes through phase 2 experiments, then Willie's operation will start. Meanwhile, Victoria had made Joe a junkie by constantly injecting him with adrenaline and neurocoline. Joe was about to go through the experiment but got into a fight with Hagen, and his phase 2 experiment was postponed. Meanwhile, Joe was having a lot of problems because of the experiments. He wasn't able to walk properly, and he also became addicted to the drugs. One day, Nurse Lee catches Joe injecting the drugs and asks him to stop. Nurse Lee gives him recordings of the experiments done on Benny, and Joe realizes the true nature of Dr. Charles. Joe decides to confess everything to the police and hand over Dr. Charles and his team. But before that, Joe hides his brother in a safe space. He later asked Lee and the nurses to remove the artificial muscle from his body. They operated on him and removed the artificial muscles, but were unable to remove the chip because it was attached to his spinal cord. After Joe recovers from the operation, Gregor and Hagen, from the inner circle of Dr. Charles, kidnap Joe and take him to the roof. They try to kill him, the same way they killed Svan, but fail to because the nurses have removed the battery inside Joe's chip. Joe somehow kills off Gregor, but Hagen stops Joe by threatening to kill Willie. Joe was taken to an operating theater, where he was to be protected by Dr. Charles. But Nurse Lee arrives at his aid and hands him a weapon to fight off Dr. Charles. Joe attacks Dr. Charles, but his inner circle members come to attack Joe and Lee. Lee presses the emergency siren, and all the other doctors arrive on the site, preventing Charles's inner circle from killing Joe and Lee. Hagen knows that Dr. Charles has committed a lot of crimes, and he would be sentenced to death. To prevent Dr. Charles from going to prison, Hagen kills off Dr. Charles with his own hand, thus ending the nightmare named Dr. Charles. Marvelous verdict. Anatomy 1 was one of the finest pieces of work ever made. Making a movie like this back in the 2000s required conviction and a unique set of filmmaking skills. Anatomy 1 was a huge success and gave us some scenes that would haunt us for the rest of our lives. Anatomy 2 had an excellent concept on paper, but when it came to execution, it failed miserably. The supposed horror scenes were not as haunting or as disturbing as the scenes from Anatomy 1, but it's not like the whole movie was a dud. What we are trying to say is that the first movie was more of a horror movie, and the second was more like a mystery thriller. So, should you watch these movies? Well, the answer depends on your taste. If you love horror and slasher movies with some bloodshed and scenes that seem too real to put into a movie, then these movies are a feast for you. But if you are someone who doesn't like to watch human bodies being dissected in front of you, then you should stay away from it. There's a reason why the movie is named Anatomy. With that being said, if you liked our content, do like it and subscribe if you haven't already. Have a good one and be safe. Thanks everyone.